Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. An ordinary episode today, not a bulletin for once, because I've been planning to talk about this for a while and finally getting a chance to do it. Hope you enjoy the topic today, even though I am venturing into a controversial minefield, and that is climate change. Now, I know that many of you believe that this isn't a valid thing, that this is some sort of a hoax or a conspiracy, but nevertheless, these are the things that I believe about climate change. Number one, the temperatures on this planet are increasing. We're seeing the results of that this summer all over the planet, and I'm going to be mentioning that in the course of this video. Number two, carbon dioxide is directly connected to increasing temperatures and a greenhouse effect. We have seen evidence of that throughout the solar system. And as a matter of fact, Elon Musk is planning on changing the climate on Mars and increasing the temperature there by introducing a lot of additional CO2. Just as Elon believes that Mars can be terraformed with CO2, I also believe that humanity is capable of changing the climate with a lot of CO2. And number three, we are pouring billions and billions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year, and that amount continues to increase in spite of our best efforts. But here's something else that I believe. As long as we remain restricted to our home planet, as long as we keep trying to innovate our way out of this problem without seeking solutions elsewhere, we're not going to be able to solve it. All of the solutions that the eco-warriors, that the climate change activists tell us are going to solve these problems, whether it be getting rid of all fossil fuels, slaughtering all of the cattle and going to vegan diets or whatever else they might have in mind. None of these things are going to solve this problem as long as we remain inside a closed system, as long as our power-hungry civilization continues to consume more and more power with every passing year. And so that's why I'm going to share some excerpts of my new book with you today, explaining why a closed system cannot solve this problem, if it is indeed a problem. Once again, I want to emphasize that I do not 100% believe that climate change is exclusively caused by human activity. It could be a natural cause that we just don't understand yet, just like Oumuamua's behavior may be caused by something natural that we don't understand yet, but I tend to believe that it is artificial because we have a good artificial explanation for it. But as long as we remain inside a closed system, we are not going to be able to solve this problem. But Starship can transport us out of that closed system and produce a very innovative solution. Now, first of all, let me emphasize that I very much respect everybody on both sides of this argument, and if you want to present a counter-argument to what I have to say in this video, feel free to send me a peer-reviewed statement, or a peer-reviewed paper, that is, that I can have a look at. If it seems valid to me, I'd be happy to broadcast the information contained in this paper. Once again, I don't have a problem with climate change deniers, nor do I have a problem with vegans. As a matter of fact, my producer is a vegan, so please don't take any of this personally. Today's world reminds me of the opening minutes of the movie Interstellar. Of all the films I've seen, Interstellar is perhaps the best cautionary tale I've watched concerning the consequences of a one-world civilization. We are transported to a dying Earth deprived of resources, modern technology, and most forms of plant life. Once productive farmland is consumed by the mother of all Dust Bowl storms every year, and human civilization is almost exclusively focused on growing the few crops that can still survive the harsh new ecosystem. The U.S. education system barely functions and has been redesigned to train new farmers. Even worse, revisionist historians have taken over the curriculum, replacing the story of the Apollo program with the fiction of faked moon landings designed to bankrupt the Soviet Union. The school system is presumably doing this to keep the remnants of mankind focused on our dying world and not hopeless dreams of worlds beyond. One would hope that future American educators aren't going to be deluded enough to actually believe such nonsense, but recent events make me wonder sometimes. For the sake of my children and others, I hope that a nightmare world like this is many decades ahead of us. But, barring huge changes in industry, energy use, and individual behavior, a nightmare awaits our species if we insist on remaining restricted to our home planet. There are, of course, many who believe that this is alarmist thinking mixed with an unhealthy dose of exaggeration and sensationalism. Our world is far more resilient than science fiction writers suppose. Human civilization is incapable of severely damaging our planet. The Earth's resources and available living space are more than capable of supporting the current population for centuries. If this is indeed the case, the planet has a strange way of showing it. For those of you who regularly watch my channel, you probably know that I'm disinclined to embrace the opinions of the scientific community. Although I don't discount studies about Arctic ice, polar bear migration patterns, and so on, this evidence alone is not enough to convince me that the world is going through radical changes. I prefer evidence closer to home, events that impact my life and the lives of my viewers. I don't like heat. I loathe humidity. Given the fact that I've lived in South Carolina for a quarter century, you might think that I'm often dissatisfied with the weather, and you'd be right. When the air is damp and as hot as an oven, I often check the news to see if any temperature records have tumbled, and all too often, they have. As I'm recording this, running up a huge power bill with my HVAC, the people of Texas have been seriously testing the limits of their power grid, doing the same thing. After setting 11 peak demand records in the summer of 2022, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, forecast that usage would shatter the previous record of 80,828 megawatts 4 times over the next 2 weeks of July, peaking at 84,135 megawatts on July 18th, 2023. I suspect that Texans didn't suddenly decide to run all of their appliances 5% more often in 2023. Rather, these figures probably have something to do with the fact that cities like Corpus Christi, San Antonio, McAllen, Laredo, Houston, Austin, and Midland all broke records in the summer of 2023. Now, currently, ERCOT claims that they are capable of handling this massive load, but if this ever changes, the sweltering Texas heat is likely to become lethal as it has in India this summer, where the northern provinces of Uttar Pradesh and eastern Bihar, which are generally accustomed to milder temperatures, experienced temperatures as high as 113 degrees Fahrenheit, which resulted in dozens of people dying from heat-related illnesses. And at the same time, the hottest temperatures ever measured in the Northwest Territory have exacerbated a wildfire crisis that has, thus far, burned 22.7 million acres in Canada. The previous record, by the way, was 17.5 million acres, set in 1995, and the current wildfire season still has months to go. And amazingly, just south of the US-Canadian border, Vermont is drowning in the worst flood in nearly a century. These are, of course, isolated events. Heat waves, wildfires, and floods have happened in the past, and the geological record tells a tale of past climatological shifts that have had nothing to do with human activity. However, sudden changes in the past were usually connected with massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, a superflood in the aftermath of the Ice Age, or some other cataclysm. The current trend appears to be driven largely by CO2 and methane. Now, the consequences of a runaway greenhouse effect can be easily observed in the inner solar system. Our so-called twin planet Venus is a terrifying example of CO2 unleashed. At one time, scientists believe Venus was a far more hospitable world, not unlike our own. It had oceans, mild temperatures, and a healthy hydrologic cycle. But being closer to the sun, Venus experienced warmer temperatures that led to the evaporation of the oceans, a gradual buildup of CO2, which led to even warmer temperatures, which led to a faster buildup of CO2. Today, Venus is the hottest planet in the solar system, with temperatures approaching 900 degrees at the surface, or 475 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead, let alone cause forests or paper to spontaneously burst into flame. Indeed, Venus is significantly hotter than Mercury, even though Mercury is nearly 34 million miles closer to the Sun. Earth may be the next planet to set a heat record if our civilization continues to pour over 33 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. Just as Elon Musk believes that we could terraform Mars with an artificial greenhouse effect, I believe that we are equally capable of destroying our home world with an artificial greenhouse effect. However, unlike most YouTube creators who open their content with dire warnings about climate change, I'm now going to explain why green energy and radical changes in human behavior have no chance of reversing this trend. Climate activists have been howling about greenhouse gases for more than a generation. We've built sprawling solar power stations, wind farms that stretch from horizon to horizon, and even electric cars are becoming trendy now. Examining the carbon footprint of every human activity has become a religion in some circles, and woe betide any apostate who tries to buck the trend. But the holy crusade of the eco-warriors has created a worldwide backlash amongst petrol heads, oil workers, coal miners, and millions of ordinary people with an aversion to self-righteous tree hugging. And yet, in spite of all the green initiatives, Earth days, and SUV shaming, greenhouse emissions are increasing, temperatures are spiking, and climate activists are growing more frustrated. The latest antics of some of these radicals, such as defacing irreplaceable works of art, are doing far more to feed the backlash than draw attention to their cause. In the meantime, worldwide carbon emissions have shot up from 25.5 billion tons of CO2 in the year 2000 to an alarming 37.12 billion tons in 2021. The activists claim that we aren't reversing the trend because we aren't doing enough. Fossil fuels need to be banned, all coal power plants shut down, and methane-producing cattle wiped out in favor of vegan diets. And most of all, we need to stop spoiled billionaires from launching their private tourist rockets. All these unprincipled tycoons want to do is build an escape valve from our dying planet and establish a gulag on Mars or the moon, where they can rule as corporate dictators unchallenged by labor laws and so on. This is, of course, a gross oversimplification mixed with absurd falsehoods and distortions. Emissions are skyrocketing together with temperatures and once-a-century climate disasters for a variety of reasons, none of which have anything to do with tourist rockets or greedy billionaires. Firstly, formerly undeveloped countries are entering an industrial revolution. Industrial development goes hand in hand with industrial pollution, while emissions in the U.S. have actually dropped by nearly 1 billion tons since the year 2000 and by 600 million tons in the European Union. Emissions in China have tripled in the same time frame, adding almost 7.5 billion tons of CO2 in 2 decades. India has added 1 billion tons since the year 2000 as well. If every human in the US and Europe were to suddenly vanish, it would barely cover the increase in CO2 emissions in China alone. However, it isn't realistic to expect that developing nations are going to rein in their industrial growth in favor of building an expensive green power grid from the ground up. And carbon credits aside, it isn't realistic to expect that anyone is going to build it for them. To make matters worse, these so-called sustainable and green energy solutions that we have implemented have actually increased CO2 emissions in other countries, including China. Building and erecting wind turbines, for example, requires hundreds of tons of materials, including steel, concrete, fiberglass, and rare elements. All of this requires energy-intensive mining, forging steel in blast furnaces, and other activities that create a substantial carbon footprint. Building each wind turbine creates an incredible carbon footprint of 1.7 million tons, and much of this footprint impacts developing countries where this mining and manufacturing actually takes place. And solar panels are even more problematic. PV panel manufacturing has a nasty byproduct known as silicon tetrachloride, which becomes hydrogen chloride when exposed to humid air. These are damaging to the environment and toxic to humans as well. Solar panels also contain a variety of rare metals and earths, which are often mined in remote areas of the world where mining is poorly regulated. Consequently, this mining rips up third world landscapes, and solar panel processing can produce toxic runoff that makes nearby land completely uninhabitable. China, the largest producer of solar panels, is notorious for these irresponsible practices. Even more horrifying is the revolting practice of using child labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC, to mine one of these rare elements, cobalt. Cobalt is widely used in lithium-ion batteries, which are used not only in PV panels, but in electric vehicles and consumer electronics that can be found in nearly every household in the developed world. Over 70% of the world's cobalt mining occurs in the DRC, and at least 250,000 Congolese are employed in cobalt mining, and 40,000 of these are children, some as young as 6 years old. Much of this mining is an informal and unregulated affair, with laborers making less than $2 a day while using their own tools, or more frequently, their hands. And worst of all, neither solar nor wind make for particularly reliable power sources for an increasingly energy-hungry society. Regardless of geography, the wind doesn't blow all the time, nor does the sun shine reliably. Now look, I am by no means saying that these energy sources are useless or that we shouldn't be building them. In the long run, these things definitely do save on the overall carbon footprint, far more CO2 than they actually create. But it clearly isn't enough. Worldwide carbon emissions are still going up crazily. And here's the way to solve it. Number one, you have to find a way to make these alternative energy sources work all the time and produce far more energy. And number two, find a way of building them that doesn't add to the world's carbon footprint. And how do you do that? In space. The idea of putting solar power stations in space is something that dates back to the 1970s, an idea that's been around for a very long time, but this principle was difficult to exploit because getting anything to space was such an expensive endeavor. Not so much anymore. Once Starship becomes operational, it will be able to deploy colossal numbers of PV satellites into either geosynchronous orbit or into a slightly lower orbit that will give it continuous access to the Earth and zero time in shadow. That being the case, then, it's not going to have any interference from the Earth's atmosphere, nor is it going to ever experience nighttime or a cloudy day or anything else. Solar panels deployed in space are going to be 8 times as efficient as solar panels on Earth, with 8 times the power generating capability, and with no downtime, you've got your continuous power source. Now, Starship will not be able to deploy these satellites in low Earth orbit. Solar panels need to be delivered either to geosynchronous orbit or to a MEO location in order to be far more efficient and to have no downtime. But Starship's enormous fairing and tremendous payload capability capacity will allow it to carry up to 100,000 of these tiny satellites, delivering 100 megawatts worth of power. Each satellite is very lightweight and 1.65 meters in diameter, and you can combine them into solar power stations that generate as much as 20 gigawatts per power station, and they transmit their energy to the ground via a 10 gigahertz microwave transmitter. And for those of you who are thinking that this is going to microwave people who happen to be in the way or take down aircraft, that kind of thing, it's already been tested on drones and human test subjects. This particular frequency does not harm human tissue any more than a cell phone transmission does. And as you can see, it's transmitted down to 1.5 kilometer rectennas located on the Earth. Yes, it is pretty sizable, but when you compare it to the size of a solar array that generates the same amount of power, it's much smaller, consumes far less real estate, and therefore far less materials as well. By the way, what you're watching right now is a promotional video from a company called Virtus Solis, and they've done an in-depth analysis of the cost per kilowatt hour that it will require to put solar power stations like this into orbit utilizing Starship, and they break it down based on the number of reuses that you can get out of Starship. It gets pretty expensive, $207 per megawatt hour, which is far more expensive than most other alternatives if you only get one use out of the Starship. However, if you get 15 reuses out of Starship, that drops down to $28 per megawatt hour, which is far less expensive than solar, wind, coal, or anything else. Therefore, if Starship lives up to its promise of reusability, it can make what was previously the most expensive green energy solution into the least expensive energy solution of any kind. And it gets even better than that. First of all, there are those who say that this isn't going to work, that this kind of power transmission going through the atmosphere is going to lose so much of its energy, so much of its efficiency, that the whole thing is just a pipe dream. Not so. Researchers at Caltech recently launched a space solar power demonstrator, and it proved without a doubt that this energy can be reliably transmitted both from orbit down to Earth and vice versa. It's an effective and viable solution for power transmission. Really, the most efficient solution that's out there, and once again, a solution that's most efficiently delivered by Starship. But what about the expense of building these things? Obviously, building these kinds of colossal orbital power stations are still going to have all the carbon footprint problems of PV panels on Earth, plus all the other unpleasant things that go with manufacturing them, right? Well, not necessarily. What if you could find all of the necessary materials for PV panels in space? Well, indeed you can. The vast majority of the materials that are used for constructing solar panels are silicon, and that's available in huge quantities on the moon, plus all of the metals, all of the rare earths and rare elements that are necessary for PV panel manufacturing can be found either on the moon or in the asteroids. Recently, Blue Origin demonstrated that in situ photovoltaic cells could be manufactured out of lunar regolith, or at least simulated lunar regolith, something that we suspect is very much like what we would find on the surface of the moon, and they were able to manufacture these amazing in situ produced photovoltaic cells in vast quantities on the moon and then deliver them to Earth orbit for 1/6 the energy required, as opposed to trying to deliver them from an earthbound destination. That being the case, then, not only can you make solar power stations far more efficient in orbit, you can also manufacture and deliver them for a lot less energy and a lot less expense. Assuming, of course, that we can build the necessary infrastructure to get all of this going. And that, of course, is amazingly expensive. Now, ESA, in conjunction with the United Kingdom Space Agency, are investing millions of euros or millions of pounds in trying to build a test power station in geosynchronous orbit sometime in the future, but once again, we're talking about billions of euros here, something that isn't going to be an easy thing to raise if investors are difficult to come by. But there is a way to raise the necessary capital as long as you get the world engaged in the project in order to take care of the expense. The money is there, and I'm going to explain how all of this is possible later on in my book. What I've done in this video is simply scratch the surface of not only this issue, but other serious problems that exist in our closed-off society, our one-world civilization that is simply beginning to burst at the seams, and the way that Starship can address all of these issues in the future if we invest in it. My book is scheduled for release in late August. If you're interested in a copy, please contribute $10 either to my GoFundMe or to my PayPal account listed in the description, and that also includes a ticket to any of my events in North America during my tour. Thus far, I have 6 cities confirmed, but it's going to be 15 cities eventually. I have the current cities listed in the description as well. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe. That's also very important to the success of my channel. And as always, stay angry about space.